Before democracy meant what we now ask it to mean, every city that practiced it had already drawn a boundary. On one side stood those who belonged, citizens whose names, families, and obligations tied them to the polis. Around them lived the people on whom the city depended, but whom it did not fully admit. Foreign residents paid taxes and served in war, yet had no voice in the laws that governed them. Women managed households, property, rituals, and family lines, while remaining excluded from formal political power. Enslaved people worked in homes, workshops, fields, and mines, including the silver mines, whose wealth helped pay for the fleet that defended Athenian freedom. The Greeks called this political community the polis. But the polis was never only a set of walls, temples, and public squares. It was also a system for deciding who counted and who could be present, useful, even indispensable, without ever becoming equal. What follows is not simply the story of Athens and Sparta as rivals, though they were. It is the story of that boundary, how Greek cities defined citizenship, how they defended it, and how much of their wealth and power rested on those placed beyond it. The boundary appeared in law, but it did not remain there. It entered the household, the marketplace, the sanctuary, the assembly, and the battlefield. It shaped where people could go, what they could own, whom they could marry, and how they would be remembered after death. If you find this kind of patient, immersive exploration meaningful, a like or subscription helps make the next story possible. And sharing it with one person who might value it is one of the most helpful things you can do. Now let your shoulders settle into whatever is holding you. Let the evening carry a little of the weight the day has left behind. And as the noise begins to recede, let us pass through the gates into Athens, Sparta, and the 1,000 Greek city-states that surrounded them. This is the world of ancient Greece. Before dawn in the countryside outside Athens, a citizen sets out on foot for the city. He lives in one of the outer demes, somewhere like Marathon or Rhamnus, far enough away that reaching the city costs him real time. The road ahead stretches for hours. The fields behind him will not tend themselves while he is gone. No single ancient writer describes this exact walk. It is a reconstruction built from the known distances between the villages and the city and the hours the assembly kept, not an eyewitness account, and offered here as exactly that. But the underlying math is not invented. A day spent walking to the meeting ground was a day not spent at the plough. That trade was real, whether or not any single farmer ever wrote it down. Athenian law gave every citizen the same formal right to attend the assembly, no matter where he lived, and for most of the 5th century, nothing changed that. A citizen from an outer deme held exactly the same right to stand in the assembly as a man who slept inside the city walls each night. The law never mentioned where a citizen lived. It never had to. Distance limited who could actually exercise that right, quietly, in a way no court could ever be asked to overturn, because no law had actually been broken. Tens of thousands of adult men held this right on paper. Only a fraction of them could realistically reach the hill on any given morning, and distance, far more than any decree, decided which fraction that would be. A right a man cannot afford to use is a right in name only. The 4th century finally addressed that imbalance, though only after Athens had lived with it for generations. the city began paying citizens to attend the assembly. The payment started small. Not long after democracy returned from a brief period of oligarchy, the state agreeing for the first time that a citizen's presence was worth something in coin. A rival politician outbid the first offer almost immediately, and for a while the two men kept raising each other's rate, each trying to win the same crowd's favor. The rate that finally held was modest, but it was a start. By the time the philosopher Aristotle was cataloguing the Athenian constitution, decades later, the payment had grown into something close to a full day's wage. An ordinary meeting now paid enough to matter. The year's most important session paid even more. Measured against what an ordinary laborer earned in a day, the 4th century rate was no longer a token gesture. It had grown into something close to full compensation for the day citizens were giving up. But the walk came first, for generations, long before any payment answered it. Before the payments closed, the gap between farm and city, distance alone decided who showed up. The men who lived nearest the city were, disproportionately, the men who actually reached the assembly floor. The men who lived farthest bore a cost the law never addressed, because the law had never been written to account for it. Inside the walls, mourning in the agora looks at first like any other mourning. Vendors call out their prices. Neighbors trade news over baskets and stalls. Citizens who are supposed to be climbing toward the paean wicks are instead standing in the shade, unhurried, showing no rush toward a duty that technically belongs to every one of them. Public slaves move in among the loiterers. Scythian archers kept on hand for exactly this purpose. They drag a rope freshly dipped in wet red dye through the crowd, sweeping the stragglers uphill toward the meeting ground. Anyone caught afterward with the telltale color on his clothes has plainly been dawdling, and a fine follows. A surviving comic play records the scene and plays it for laughter. Citizens who would rather gossip in the market than govern from the hill. The joke was familiar enough that the ancient writer never bothered explaining the rope any further. It's worth noting who is doing the herding. Men with no share in the government at all, enslaved men, are physically driving free citizens toward a right those same men will never be allowed to hold themselves. The crowd being swept toward the paean wicks does not stop being sorted once it arrives. Wooden barriers stand at the meeting ground itself, plain fencing built for function rather than display. A matching set stands in the marketplace too, very likely helping funnel citizens toward the climb in the first place, much as the rope already had. On the hill, the barriers serve a more specific purpose. They separate citizens who may take part in the assembly from onlookers who may only watch. Not everyone present that morning holds the same standing, and the fencing makes that standing visible long before anyone raises a hand to vote. The same barriers appear, years apart, in the speeches of the orator Demosthenes, mentioned each time as an ordinary fixture, something his audience would already recognize without explanation. Comedy mentions them too, which is its own kind of evidence. A joke about the fence only works if everyone already knows what it's for. Even the most democratic meeting ground in the ancient world required a fence. It sorted the same assembled crowd by status before a single vote was ever cast. The same body that just voted on the hill now turns to a different kind of ownership. Down at the mining district of Laurion, city officials run an auction of their own. Not for grain, not for timber, but for the right to dig into the earth itself. A citizen can bid on a plot and win it. A wealthy, long-settled foreigner cannot bid at all, no matter how much silver he has already helped this city make. The rule holds even for a man who has lived in Athens for decades, paid its taxes, and buried his dead in its soil. He can watch the auction. He cannot enter it. The officials take the fee, hand over the plot, and step away. Their only role is to own the ground and decide who may work it. Everything after that is left to the winning bidder: the digging, the timbering, the hauling of ore, and whatever enslaved labor he brings to do it. The mineral wealth under this land belongs to the community itself, not to whoever happens to be able to pay for it. Citizenship decides who can dig, the same way it decided who could vote. Thousands of shafts and galleries now lie mapped beneath that district, plot after plot, each one once sold under exactly this rule, to exactly this narrow class of buyer. One of those leases survives in far more detail than the rest, because it ended up in a courtroom rather than a ledger. A man named Pantanetos paid a small fortune for a few years' rights to a single working, a serious sum, backed by serious risk. It survives only because the orator Demosthenes later argued a case that turned on it, which is the reason anyone today can put a price on what a mining lease actually cost a private citizen. Either side could walk away when the term ran out, or sit down and strike the bargain again, much like any ordinary lease renewed or abandoned once its time was up. Most leases like it left no trace at all. This one survives purely as a byproduct of a dispute between two men arguing about something else entirely, and historians are left reconstructing an entire market from the wreckage of a single lawsuit, one contract standing in for thousands that vanished without a mark. That same silver had already reshaped the city once before, in a decision made decades earlier and far more consequential than any single lease. Early in the 5th century, the mines struck an unusually rich vein, and by custom the windfall belonged to the citizens themselves, divided into individual shares. The historian Herodotus records the payout, a tidy sum handed straight into private hands. He gives no total for the strike itself. Later estimates have tried, but the ancient record simply doesn't say. Themistocles rose in the assembly and argued for something else entirely. "Take the silver," he said, "and build ships instead," ostensibly to settle a running dispute with a rival island nearby. Aristides spoke for the old custom, for the payment citizens had already been promised. The assembly chose Themistocles. Every citizen in that room gave up a payment already promised to them in exchange for a fleet and a state asking to be trusted with what had, a moment earlier, been their own money. Nobody voting that day could have known they were building the ships that would meet the Persian fleet at Salamis years later. They only knew they were trading a sure payment for a warship on the word of one man arguing against the custom of a lifetime. Enslaved people were leased out in that same silver economy too, not as workers alone, but as financial assets a man could own without ever setting foot near a mine shaft. Nicias, one of the richest men in Athens, bought a slave named Sosius for a striking sum, dozens of times what an ordinary slave would cost. Sosius was worth it because he knew how to find silver and how to run a crew that dug for it. Nicias put him in charge of roughly 1,000 of his own mine slaves and stepped back from the work entirely. Sosius managed the operation, paid Nicias his agreed return, and quietly kept whatever came in above it for himself. This kind of arrangement was common enough that Xenophon describes it as an ordinary way to hold wealth, not an unusual one. A man of means no longer needed to touch the mines at all. He needed only to own the man who ran them. Somewhere beneath that arrangement, 1,000 people who were never party to any contract dug the silver that made both men rich. The city's food supply leaned on something just as far removed from citizen hands, though this time the asset was not a person but a kingdom. Up on the Black Sea, a dynasty of kings ruled a stretch of coast the Athenians relied on for grain, and by the 4th century, something close to half of the city's supply may have come from that one source alone. These kings were not democrats. They ruled a territory Athens had no say over and no claim on beyond goodwill. Athens managed that goodwill the way it might manage a difficult ally rather than an ordinary trading partner. Honors were voted in the assembly. Privileges were carved into public decree, granting these foreign kings recognition for keeping the grain flowing. Athens treated them less like trading partners and more like patrons it depended on and had to keep happy. When a law was proposed that would have stripped tax breaks from foreign benefactors, Demosthenes stood up and argued against it, pointing straight at this relationship as exactly the kind the city could not afford to unsettle over principle. A democracy built on the idea of citizen self-sufficiency needed, in practice, the continued favor of a foreign court simply to keep eating. How much Athens actually depended on that grain, though, is not settled history. It sounds like a simple fact, one number, one source, easy to state and move past. It isn't. Historians still argue about it, and the question is still open. One view reads the dependence as real but manageable, one option among several the city could draw on, with plenty of alternative supply lines most years. A more recent case argues for something sharper, a reliance closer to necessity than convenience, with the Black Sea route doing far more of the essential work than the older account allowed. Neither side has won that argument, and neither is treated here as though it had. Which reading is correct changes how precarious Athens' entire food supply actually was, year to year, decade to decade. For now, no single account settles the question either way. The honest version of the story is the dispute itself, not a resolution to it. Follow the silver back to where it was actually cut from the rock. The galleries at Laurion run narrow, in places barely wide enough to crawl through, forcing a body onto its hands and knees for the length of an entire shift. Some shafts drop far down into the dark before the first working gallery even begins. No daylight reaches any of it, not at the entrance and certainly not below. Miners worked entirely by torchlight, in air thick with smoke that had nowhere to go. They used a method called fire setting, heating the rock face until it cracked, then dousing it with water to split the stone apart faster than any chisel could. The technique worked, but it filled an already airless space with even more smoke, on top of what the torches themselves produced. Modern archaeologists re-entering these same passages today need proper safety gear just to survive the attempt. Even then, they crawl on their stomachs through sections that have not changed shape since antiquity. That match matters. If the tunnels are still this hard on a body with modern gear and modern light, the demand they placed on an ancient body, working blind by torch alone, needs no further explanation. Directly above those galleries, the town of Thorikos went about its ordinary civic and religious life, apparently untouched by what ran beneath it. Its acropolis rose on the surface, the way any Greek acropolis might. A theatre carved into the hillside, a temple precinct kept for the gods, both built and used across generations. But underneath that ordinary town, one single mine extends for miles of interconnected shafts and galleries. Teams of archaeologists mapped it only recently, using drones above ground and modern caving techniques below, entering sections no one had reached since the ancient world abandoned them, sealed and forgotten for over 2,000 years. The theatre where citizens watched tragedy and the temple where they made their offerings sat on ground that was, underneath, almost entirely hollow. That's not just a striking coincidence of geography. It's a different pattern from the ones already seen in this account of who belonged where. Up on the hill, citizen and outsider stood on the same ground, separated by a fence. Inside a household, family and outsider were separated room by room, across the same floor. At Thorikos, the separation ran vertically instead, sacred space on the surface, the labor that paid for it running in tunnels directly underneath. The two never touched because the system was built so they never had to. Even the workforce's own religious life left a mark here, and nowhere else quite like it. Small offerings turning up in the mining district itself, a rare trace of presence from people the rest of the record barely acknowledges at all. The one real check on this entire arrangement was never reform voted from above. It was war, and the chance war gave the enslaved to run. Sparta seized and fortified a stretch of Athenian territory late in the long war between the two cities, holding it permanently for the first time, close enough that the mines themselves lay almost within sight of an enemy garrison. Ancient testimony credits that move with driving a wave of escapes. Enslaved miners suddenly had somewhere to flee to, and enemy ground close enough to reach on foot before anyone noticed they were gone. Household slaves rarely shared that same opening. A captured runaway from a private house was typically just resold, so the incentive to risk flight stayed low no matter how badly he wanted out. Mine slaves had something closer to an actual chance, and enough of them apparently took it to disrupt the whole operation for years afterward. Whether output at Laurion ever fully recovered is genuinely unclear. Historians still debate whether it was this labor shortage, the exhaustion of easily worked ore, or both together that kept the mines from reaching their old numbers again. No source settles which. What the record does show is a system built entirely around auction, ownership, and lease, one that survived setback after setback, except the one that might have questioned whether any of it was owed in the first place. The labor system beneath the city has been laid bare now, mapped downward from the auction block on the surface to the tunnel floor beneath it. Now follow that same silver back up, out of the ground, into coin, and onto the ships bound for Piraeus. That silver moved as coin, and coin moved as ships, down to Piraeus, where the harbor is full of voices the assembly hill never hears. A man steps off a grain freighter with salt still drying on his forearms. Before he does anything else in this city, he owes it money simply for staying. This tax existed for one purpose only, to mark, once a year, every year, that he was not a citizen and never would be. It was not a customs fee or a business tax. 12 drachmas from a man, enough to cover his whole household. 6 from a woman living without a husband or father to pay it for her. Neither sum was ruinous. Either could be earned in a single day of ordinary work. The tax was never designed to break anyone financially. It was designed to remind them on a fixed date of exactly what they were not. Paying it changed nothing about his legal footing, because paying it was never the point. A second requirement mattered more, and it was far more dangerous. Every resident foreigner in Athens had to be registered under a citizen sponsor, simply to exist within the machinery of the law at all. No sponsor meant no standing to sue or be sued properly, and no way to hold a contract on solid ground. A man caught without one could be hauled into court, and conviction did not end in a fine. It could end in the loss of everything he owned and in his own enslavement. So the city took his tax money every year, and in exchange it offered him a legal existence that depended entirely on one other man's willingness to keep vouching for him. That dependency never expired, and it did not soften with time. It did not pass down lighter to the next generation either. A family could live in Athens for 80 years, marry within the resident community at Piraeus, and bury 3 generations in Attic soil. Their grandchildren would still be outsiders on the day they were born, filed under the same word as the grandfather who first stepped off a boat. A son could inherit his father's workshop, his father's sponsor, even his father's place in the fleet, and he inherited the same status along with all of it, unchanged. The only way out was citizenship itself, and it was never something a family could earn over time. It was a gift, and the assembly alone decided when to give it, one vote, one name, one exception at a time. It came only for service the city judged extraordinary enough to justify bending its own rule. Years of quiet residence never earned it, however many, and neither did wealth, however substantial. Most families never received it, and neither would their children after them. Land shows most clearly what the vote alone controlled and money could not buy. However wealthy a man grew, however many decades his family had rented workshops or funded ships, he could not own property in Attica. Not a house. Not a field. Not even the ground a family tomb sat on, unless the assembly granted him that right by name, and even then it was remembered as an exception tied to one particular man, not treated as a normal door anyone could walk through. That same exclusion reached down into the earth itself. The silver mines belonged to the citizen body as citizens, not as capital, so no outside fortune, however large, could buy a lease to dig there. Land had always anchored political standing in Athens, and the city guarded that asset with unusual care. And still the city asked these men to pay for its wars. Wealthy outsiders owed the same emergency war tax as any citizen of equal means, raised whenever Athens needed money fast. Some funded a warship outright or paid for a chorus at festival, the same civic burdens the richest citizens carried. In one surviving tax year, their contributions came to roughly a sixth of everything collected from the wealthiest citizens combined, a real share of the war chest from men who could not vote to authorize the war and had no claim on whatever the assembly later voted to distribute from victory. Many rode in the fleet themselves or served in the infantry units set aside for men of their status, risking exactly what a citizen risked in the same battle line. No assembly pay reached them afterward. No jury pay. No share of any land the city seized and handed out. They paid in full and were repaid in nothing but permission to keep living where they already lived. Grain shows this arrangement most plainly. The dealers who kept Piraeus fed, buying and selling the wheat that came in off the ships, were overwhelmingly outsiders, men shut out of land and mining alike and pushed by that exclusion toward the one trade Athens had left genuinely open to them. The city needed every one of them working, every ship unloaded, every measure weighed and sold before the harbor emptied for the night. But it also treated them as a class, like men who might be cheating it. Officials watched the grain market specifically, on guard against dealers hoarding stock back from the public or quietly inflating prices against a hungry city. One surviving courtroom speech aimed at a group of grain sellers accused of exactly that shows the suspicion plainly, and a jury willing to believe it. The city that could not feed itself without these men was also the city most ready to drag them into court over how they sold what they sold. Piraeus held both of those truths at once, more completely than anywhere else in Attica. Up on the meeting hill and in the marketplace, the line between citizen and outsider appeared only on fixed days, at fixed hours, then withdrew again, a rope dragged through loiterers, wooden barriers set up only when the assembly actually gathered. Down at the harbor, that line never withdrew. It ran through the same arcades and warehouses every day, where citizen and outsider bought fish from the same stalls, borrowed from the same moneylenders, and worshipped on occasion at the same festivals. They argued over the same contracts, and stood equally exposed to the same suspicion whenever the market turned tight. On the hill above, belonging and exclusion took turns. Down at the harbor, they simply shared the street every day it was open. This same population helped bring the city's government back after it fell. In 404 BCE, a group known as the 30 Tyrants seized power in Athens and turned on citizens and outsiders alike, seizing property and ordering executions without much distinction between the two. But outsiders as a group are named again and again in what survives of the restoration that followed, not as bystanders to it, but as people who funded and fought for the democracy's return with their own money and their own bodies. The orator Lysias gives their contribution unusually prominent space in his own funeral speech for the war dead, praising their loyalty in terms rarely spent on anyone but citizens. Later readers have noted he had his own reasons to make that case as loudly as he did, since wider recognition was very much his own cause as well. A separate decree from the same period rewards, by name, the foreigners among the defenders of democracy. Most of what any of them received back for it was narrow, whatever the size of what they had given. A right to own a house, exemption from the yearly tax that marked them as outsiders, and rarely, citizenship itself, which, as one man's case shows, rarely held. Lysias knew exactly how rarely, because he lived it. He and his brother ran a shield-making workshop at Piraeus, prosperous enough that the 30 came for it directly. His brother was arrested and executed, and Lysias fled into exile with what he could carry. From exile, he funded the resistance that marched back into the city, arming the very men who overthrew the regime that had killed his brother. When democracy returned, the assembly voted to make him a citizen. The grant did not survive the year. It was struck down on a technicality, and the vote that should have ended his life as an outsider simply evaporated, sending him back to the very status he had risked everything to escape. He prosecuted his brother's killer anyway, that same year, using one of the narrow legal paths still open to him without a citizen speaking on his behalf. He spent the rest of his career writing courtroom speeches for other men to deliver, since he could draft the words but not stand before a jury and speak them himself the way a citizen could. He had bought back a democracy that would not, in the end, buy him. Even Athenian comedy knew what this arrangement looked like from the outside. In one of Aristophanes' plays, a character calls resident foreigners the bran of the citizens, the rough husk left over once the real grain has been sifted out and kept. Audiences laughed at the line in a theatre. These very men could not vote to fund or govern in a city that needed their hands to help build and run it anyway. The insult and the dependency sat inside the same joke, delivered on a stage they had helped pay for through their own taxes, and nobody on either side of it seems to have found that strange enough to remark on. Now turn to the household. The outsider lived inside the city, but outside the citizen body. A woman faced a second, stranger version of the same problem. She lived inside the very house that produces citizens and remained outside citizenship herself, just the same. One room in a well-off Athenian house was built with real thought about who could see inside it. Its door was set slightly off-center on purpose, so that when it stood open during a men's drinking party, no one passing in the street could glimpse the room within. The floor there carried the finest decorated work in the whole house, and a raised border ran along the walls, built to support the couches men reclined on while they drank. Modern archaeologists studying the ruins of these houses were the ones who first noticed this pattern was deliberate, not an accident of design. That one room shows real thought about who could see into a house and under what conditions. It does not prove a whole house built to seal women away inside it. That is a much larger claim than a single room can carry. The rest of the evidence argues the opposite. One Greek city was destroyed so suddenly by an invading army that its houses were never rebuilt or emptied out afterward, preserved instead as a single frozen moment rather than centuries of slow change. Archaeologists mapped where loom weights actually turned up across roughly 100 of its excavated houses, room by room, alongside cooking pots and storage jars. They found them scattered everywhere, not gathered into one enclosed women's quarter the way the old picture from literature assumed. Weaving happened wherever the light was good that day, in whichever room caught the sun through the courtyard, not behind some dedicated door marked for it alone. Loom weights even turned up inside that same carefully designed drinking room, meaning the same space plausibly hosted a woman's loom in the morning and a men's party by evening, not a household split cleanly down a gendered line. One influential scholar has drawn both findings together into a single argument. The architecture was never designed to confine women inside the house at all. It was designed to control what unrelated men from outside could see and reach once they crossed the threshold. Entryways were offset, so no passerby's eye could travel straight through to the courtyard. Street-facing windows sat small and set high, well above easy sight lines. That one room, and in shops a room facing the street, gave outside men their single legitimate point of contact with the household. It worked as a filter against intrusion, not a cage around the women already living freely within it. A veiled woman crosses the street toward the marketplace, cloth folded back over her head in a shape the Greeks themselves once called a little roof. She is not hiding in her house. She is walking through the middle of the city in full daylight, carrying, in effect, a portable version of the same protection that room offered at home. The idea that Athenian women lived shut away behind walls, unseen and unmoving, was never quite true, even on its own terms. Women worked in the fields. They sold goods from market stalls, ran inns, and wove and sold cloth from workshops that opened straight onto public streets. One surviving courtroom speech even describes a real household's women's quarters, not as some locked fortress, but as an ordinary room in an ordinary house, opening onto an ordinary life outside it. One scholar reads this evidence as showing something narrower than blanket confinement, separation from unrelated men, enforced mainly around matters of sexual honor and household reputation, not a rule against ever leaving the house. It remains one reading, not settled fact, and it sits alongside the archaeology rather than simply proving or disproving it. The veil itself may have worked the same way, according to one genuinely counterintuitive argument. Periods of heavier veiling in the sources line up with periods of greater female movement in public, not less. Made socially invisible behind the cloth, a woman gained a kind of license to be seen crossing the marketplace that an unveiled woman would not have had. The veil did not keep her home. It let her leave it, concealment working as the very thing that made mobility possible rather than its opposite. Sparta complicates the picture further, with numbers Aristotle himself thought worth recording. By his account, Spartan women owned or controlled nearly 2/5 of all the land in Sparta by the 4th century BCE, a concentration of property no Athenian woman could have approached under her own name. Aristotle blamed frequent heiresses, women inheriting because no son survived to inherit instead, and dowries that arrived as land itself rather than the movable goods an Athenian bride typically brought with her. He saw the pattern as a symptom of decline, land draining slowly out of the hands of men who could still afford their place among the citizen class. Modern scholarship reads the same evidence differently. Research into Spartan marriage patterns points to unions arranged deliberately within the same extended family, structured specifically to keep property from leaving the lineage, even when a woman had a living brother who might otherwise have inherited alone. That pattern suggests Spartan women held real inheritance rights far earlier than a story about later dowry inflation would allow, not a late distortion creeping into the system, but a feature of how Spartan property had worked for a very long time. On Crete, the city of Gortyn went further still and left the evidence carved directly into stone. A long legal code cut into the wall of a public building sometime in the mid-5th century BCE, granted Gortynian women rights an Athenian woman never held. A Gortynian woman could own land outright, with no male guardian standing between her and her own property. She could walk into court and argue her own case, as plaintiff or as defendant, entirely under her own name. If her marriage ended in divorce, or her husband's death left her a widow without children, the law let her keep what was hers, including half of any cloth she had woven herself during the marriage. But the stone that grants all this says almost nothing about what any Gortynian woman actually did with the rights it gave her. Athens left behind courtroom speeches, comic plays and houses excavated room by room, a thick layer of ordinary behavior that lets historians check the law against daily life, and it often contradicts what the law alone would suggest. Gortyn left none of that layer at all. No courtroom speech survives, arguing a real case before a real jury. No comic stage mocked or praised a Gortynian wife the way Athenian comedy so often did its own women. No excavated house has yielded the kind of room-by-room picture Athens can offer. The code says what a woman there was legally entitled to do, and stops there. What she actually did with that entitlement in the ordinary run of her days is a silence the stone was never going to break. Two forms of belonging without membership stand complete now. The outsider lived inside the city, working its harbor and funding its wars, yet still stood outside the body that governed it. The woman lived inside the very household that produced the next generation of citizens, yet still remained outside citizenship herself, whatever a doorway's angle or a veil's fold might grant her in the street. A stranger boundary still waits past both of these, one neither a tax bill nor a woman's veil quite prepares you for. The one that turns a person into property a god can hold. From belonging without citizenship to the harder case entirely, a person treated as property. One inscribed stone at Delphi records a name, a price, and a sale to Apollo. It was never really a sale at all. The words on the stone follow a fixed formula, repeated across the sanctuary walls. A master's name. An enslaved person's name. A price paid in silver. Then the god's name, standing where a human buyer's name would normally go. It looks, at first, like Apollo bought a person. He didn't. No money changed hands with the god, and the god held nothing afterward. The sale was a legal fiction, built to solve a problem that had nothing to do with religion. The problem was this: an enslaved person had no standing under the law to enter into a contract. They could not sue. They could not be sued. They could not agree to anything, including their own freedom. A master could simply decide to free someone, but that decision lived only in his own household and his own memory, unwitnessed and unrecorded. Consecration to Apollo fixed this. A god could hold property that no court would ever question, and a god held no one in any real sense. Once the sale was carved into stone, the person passed out of a master's ownership and into a form of ownership that functioned, in practice, as freedom. One surviving inscription shows how far this fiction could stretch. A citizen of Delphi sold an enslaved person to Apollo, and in the same document to a second god at a second sanctuary. Two gods, two temples, one transaction. No real sale works that way. No buyer purchases the same object twice in two places for two different owners to hold. The document only makes sense for what it actually was, not a sale but legal protection built with just enough of a sale's shape to hold up. This fiction rarely stood alone. A second clause was often attached with a name of its own, paramon, a continued service obligation that stayed in force even after freedom had been granted. A person consecrated to the god left the transaction legally free and still owed their former master service, usually work in the home, for as long as that master lived. Freedom and obligation sat in the same document, side by side, neither one cancelling the other. What that obligation actually meant for the person living under it remains the most contested question in the record, and it stays unresolved here. One view holds that the law recognized only a strict binary, free or enslaved, and that talk of anything in between is a modern misreading. Another argues the opposite, that these people held a real, distinct middle status, neither fully free nor fully bound. A third calls it closer to indentured servitude, freedom in law with a debt still owed in practice. Scholars who study these stones have not settled the question, and this account does not settle it either. This careful system did not start out careful. In the earliest periods, manumission was a private, almost casual act, a master's spoken decision, witnessed by no one outside his own household, recorded nowhere durable. A freed person's status rested entirely on memory and goodwill, which meant it rested on nothing once the master died. Heirs contested it. Households simply forgot it or claimed to. Over time, masters and the people they freed both grew wary of that same weakness. The response was to make the transaction harder to deny, inscribed in stone, posted at a sanctuary for anyone to read, built to outlast the household that made it. Sanctuary walls became something close to public archives, kept to withstand a challenge before one was even made. The same instinct that put the record in stone soon added conditions to it as well. Freedom, once written down, could carry clauses meant to protect it in a way memory alone never could. By the time Rome ruled this region, the system was still working, sturdy enough to absorb a piece of Roman law without losing its Greek shape. The Paramone clauses belonged to this same period, right when the drive to formalize these agreements was at its strongest. Most of what survives about conditional freedom comes from exactly this stretch of time, carved into stone that was already being cut for other reasons. None of this grew more elaborate by accident. Two pressures pushed it forward, one from each side of the arrangement. The first came from the dead. A master's heirs stood to lose real property the moment a manumission took effect, and a family with something to lose rarely let it go quietly. Heirs and creditors challenged these arrangements after a death, arguing the sale had never been valid. A sale carved onto a sanctuary wall in plain view was itself a defense against that challenge, a public record built to survive a dispute in a private courtroom. The second pressure came from the living, from the very people these contracts were meant to bind. A legal fiction did not erase a person's actual will, and some who still owed service after their freedom simply left. Flight tested directly how much power a master still held once the sale to the god was already carved in stone. Each time it happened, it showed how much of Paramone rested on threat alone, not on any real hold over the person's body. Masters answered flight the way anyone answers a threat they can't fully prevent, by tightening the terms. Penalties grew heavier. Third parties gained the right to enforce a contract the original master could no longer enforce alone. Money was put on the line, forfeited if service lapsed. Some contracts, under this same pressure, added a check on the master instead of another weapon for him, a clause naming a third party to judge disputes rather than leaving the verdict entirely in the former owner's hands. It was a safeguard an ordinary enslaved person, sold under no such fiction, would never have had reason to expect. One clause shows how sharply this authority split along gender lines. The historian Lane Rubinstein studied dozens of documents that let a beneficiary hand off physical punishment to a third party acting on their behalf. Nearly half of these applied to male freedpersons, boys included. Almost none applied to a woman. The clause solved a specific, practical problem. A female beneficiary, or an elderly one, was often bound to a grown man or a teenage boy, and she frequently lacked the standing or the physical strength to carry out a severe punishment herself. So the law let her delegate that power instead to a male enforcer acting on her word. These arrangements were often paired with a second clause protecting that enforcer from any later legal claim. In other words, a woman could authorize punishment, but she was rarely expected to carry it out herself. Another contract shows the same imbalance from the opposite side. In the manumission of a girl named Callo, her owner Pollia was granted the right to punish her in whatever way she wanted, but 4 words were attached that changed everything: as a free woman. Scholars reading this clause believe it did real legal work, not decoration. It barred the punishments reserved for people still enslaved: branding, binding, public whipping, while still permitting reprimand, reduced rations, hard labor, or a fine. The same restrictive phrase appears in other, unrelated contracts from Delphi, so it wasn't invented once for Callow alone. It was a standard legal formula used whenever a drafter needed to draw this exact line. Placed side by side, these 2 clauses might suggest a woman's authority over a freed person was weaker or more restricted than a man's. The wider pattern says otherwise. Penalty clauses of some kind appear at almost the same rate, whether the beneficiary was a woman or a man. What differed wasn't the right to punish, but the form that punishment was allowed to take once it moved from paper to a body, delegated in one case, kept away from physical force in the other, but present at nearly equal rates either way. A single stone at Delphi carries a woman's name and a price cut into it, one entry among hundreds on sanctuary walls that still catch the light at midday. Hundreds of documents in that corpus impose the stay and serve obligation, and within them a clear pattern holds. Women outnumber men among those bound under it. When a woman herself was the seller, she sold girls at a far higher rate than boys, a pattern that disappears entirely from documents handled only by men. And where the beneficiary of continued service was a woman, the labor she was owed was almost always a woman's or a girl's, just as a male beneficiary was almost always owed a man's. This was not an outside preference imposed on women. A large share of these documents name a woman as the seller, and many of those sales were carried out by women acting alone or together with other women. The choice to keep female labor inside a household, generation after generation, was frequently a woman's own decision, made about another woman's body and future, not forced on her by someone else. A price gap runs through the same stones. Women make up just over 60% of the people recorded across the whole corpus, and on average they were bought free for noticeably less than men. The inscriptions are clear about the fact of that gap, but not about its cause. They don't say why a woman's freedom cost less, whether her labor was valued differently to begin with, whether it reflected the specific service being bought out of, or simply what a woman could realistically save toward buying herself out. The stone records the number. It does not explain it, and no honest source fills in that gap. Some of the corpus hides its plainest meaning behind its blandest word. In one inscription, a woman named Dionysia frees 4 slaves born into her own household, each bound to Paramon like the others recorded on these walls. But 2 of them, Aphrodisia and Euimeria, receive a clause found nowhere else in their fellow freed persons' contracts. They must go on working from their body and in whatever other way until Dionysia dies. The word used throughout is agasia, ordinary work, the same word used for spinning, weaving, or tending a household. Here, it means something else. The phrasing closely echoes language used elsewhere to describe a known courtesan's paid sexual labor, a match specific enough that it looks deliberate. A second, related pair of stones names a woman called Leaina, a name itself linked to courtesans in comic writing of the period. She is bound to keep working, obeying a man named Philon, likely her former owner and something closer to a pimp, until his death releases her. A penalty clause backs the arrangement, giving Philon wide power to punish her if she doesn't comply. Freedom on this stone was only a word carved in it. What waited underneath, for these women specifically, was the same servitude the inscription claimed to end. Further north, in Epirus, the same fictive sale mechanism did entirely different work, unrelated to sex trade or discipline. At Bothrotos, a woman named Zinnis freed her slave Larissa with no male guardian named in the document at all, something the law elsewhere would never have allowed a woman to do alone. Another woman, Hadilo, freed her slave Nearchus with only her father's consent, under what the inscription calls the law of the childless. A third, Matero, freed Antigona with the backing of two named men instead of a single formal guardian. Each case bends the normal guardianship rule further than usual. The purpose behind these manumissions was neither sentiment nor sudden generosity. A woman without sons, without a living husband, or without a male relative willing to protect her interests faced a real risk. Her own estate, including the people in it, could be claimed by in-laws or creditors the moment she could no longer defend it herself. Selling a slave to a god removed that person from the estate permanently, beyond any relative's later claim. Attaching a paramount clause to that same sale secured something else at the same time: the freed person's continued service, and with it, the woman's own guaranteed care for the rest of her life. The fiction that solved one legal problem, ownership without standing, was here used to solve a second, different one, security, without a man to provide it. That same caution reached even further, to a child not yet born. A number of Delphic inscriptions carry what scholars call mother-child clauses, language that secures a still unborn child's freedom before the child exists. Without such a clause, a child born to a freed woman during her years of service had no guaranteed status at all. Her own position was itself unsettled, nominally free, but still bound, and a former master's heirs could try to claim the child as household property the moment it was born. The clause closed that gap in advance, naming the child's freedom in the same document that granted the mother's, before anyone knew whether a child would ever come. What none of these stones can tell us is what this cost the person living under it, day after day, year after year. Under an obligation the law kept inventing new ways to enforce. The corpus is vast, well over 1,000 inscriptions recording even more individual manumissions, most of them cut into the walls at Delphi across 3 centuries. It records a legal moment with extraordinary precision, a name, a price, a clause, a god's name standing in for a buyer's. It does not record what came after. The labor performed under an obligation already signed. The daily negotiations between a nominally free person and the household still owed their service. The record is honest about what it is, a picture of the threshold being crossed, not of what waited on the other side of it. The mechanics of crossing that line into freedom lie exposed now, clause by clause. Now, to the polis that built its whole identity on a line that could never be crossed at all, Sparta. From documented contracts crossing out of slavery, to a place where almost no one crossed at all. In Sparta, citizenship was a full-time occupation, made possible only because other people did the farming. A Spartiate's land was worked by helots, generation after generation, on plots their families may have farmed since before the conquest that supposedly created this arrangement. The helot paid a fixed share of what the land produced, season after season. The Spartiate who received it trained, drilled, and ate at the common mess instead of ever touching a plough. This wasn't a lighter version of ownership. It simply moved the work of control elsewhere, onto a system built to run without the owner's constant attention. The Spartiate who owned that land rarely worked it or even watched it closely. He lived, in effect, as a landlord, drawing income from a plot he almost never visited himself. That distance was the entire point. A citizen freed from farming was a citizen free to spend his days training, drilling, and sharing the long communal meals that bound Spartan men together. The city called that bond being equals. Some historians have compared this arrangement to early European serfdom. Others, more provocatively, to plantation slavery further west and centuries later. The comparison isn't a claim that the systems were identical. It raises a real question instead. How closely did a Spartiate actually watch his own land? The evidence points toward distance rather than supervision, a household that simply collected its due and asked little else. It looked more like a landlord and a tenant than an overseer and a gang. One Roman writer, describing what he considered the ideal estate, praised land worked by tenants born to it, people who had lived there since childhood and knew no other home. That description fits Messenia well, where a Hilot family might have worked the same plot for generations. Leaving it would have meant leaving the only life anyone in that family had ever known. This system was older than the citizen ideal it eventually supported. Centuries earlier, aristocratic families from Laconia had pushed into the valley below them, and further still into Messenia, seizing land as they went. That happened generations before Spartiate meant anything like the disciplined, equal citizen of later legend. What later generations called the community of equals had begun, simply, as one clan's harvest. Before going further, one correction to the tidy picture most people carry of this place. Popular telling divides Spartan society into two groups, citizen and helot, master and unfree, as if nothing stood between them. But a third group did exist, and it's been mostly forgotten. The Piraeus lived free in their own townships scattered through the same land. They were never enslaved, and they were never Spartiate either. They served in the Spartan army alongside citizens who would never have called them equals. They ran the workshops and trades a Spartiate was forbidden to touch, since a citizen's only sanctioned occupation was war. And they mattered beyond that daily role too. When a great earthquake struck Sparta, Helots rose in revolt and the Perioikoi rose with them, active participants in a rebellion aimed squarely at the state that had always denied them a seat at its center. The people who made all of this possible are barely present in what survives to describe it. Helots are not merely a quiet presence in the historical record. They are close to silent in it, and that silence deserves to be stated plainly rather than filled in with invented detail. What is known of their daily lives comes almost entirely through the eyes of the people who owned their labor, or through later writers working at even greater distance, none of them Helots themselves. A field worked for generations by the same family survives without a single sentence in that family's own words. Specialists treat this as a defining problem, not a minor gap. A great deal of modern scholarship has focused specifically on the puzzle of the missing Helot voice, treating it as much a question of method as of conscience. It means the kind of detail an account like this one would want. What a threshing floor smelled like, what the ache in a shoulder felt like at the end of a harvest, simply cannot be sourced honestly. So this account won't invent it. That silence belongs to something wider too. Rural Greek life outside a handful of major cities survives mainly through indirect evidence. Almost no literature describes the texture of an ordinary countryside year, apart from one farming poem and a few scattered lines elsewhere. Athens left behind speeches, plays, and inscriptions by the hundred. The countryside left almost nothing in its own words. What fills that gap instead is modern archaeology. Researchers walking fields, gathering broken pottery, piecing together a rhythm of planting and harvest that no ancient writer ever thought worth setting down. The origin of the helots turns out to be less settled than it first appears. The oldest surviving account of how they came to be doesn't describe a conquest at all. It describes a punishment. Spartans who failed to take part in an earlier war were themselves judged and given the name helot, stripped of their standing. By this earliest evidence, the first helots weren't a foreign people enslaved by invaders. They were Spartans, punished by other Spartans, given a name that would outlive the memory of why. A later historian built a more familiar rebellion story on top of that account, tying the name to a place. At least 3 separate traditions once circulated about where helots actually came from, and none of them match the clean story most people know today of northern invaders conquering a native people. Archaeology offers no support for that familiar version either. No trace of any large-scale invasion into this land has ever turned up in the ground. If the conquest itself is in doubt, so is the identity of the people it supposedly conquered. A people who endure centuries of bondage are usually imagined holding tightly to who they were before it began, a memory preserved in secret, waiting to resurface. But the evidence from Messenia suggests the opposite. Its sanctuaries, its customs, even its language, look almost indistinguishable from those of the land that conquered it. When Messenia finally won its independence and needed a capital, the site chosen had, until that very moment, belonged to people whose way of life matched Sparta's own. The identity that emerged during the revolt against Sparta looks, on this reading, less like a memory that survived captivity and more like something built in the act of throwing it off, created by the very people, helot and free alike, who needed a shared past to rebel in its name. A real objection stands against this too, though there's no clear evidence this region had any single identity even before the conquest happened. That leaves both the old story and its reversal resting on a people who may not have existed yet. Either way. Even the exclusive class this whole system existed to sustain could not survive its own narrowness. In the early years, something near 8,000 men held full citizenship. Within a few generations, that number had fallen by more than half. Within 2 centuries more, it had collapsed further still, down to only a few hundred families holding both citizenship and enough land to keep it. This wasn't a population dying out generally. The helots and the free non-citizens beneath them remained numerous throughout, and by some accounts grew, even as the ruling elite thinned toward extinction. One account describes a man counting his fellow citizens in the marketplace and finding only a few dozen, lost in a crowd of thousands. The cause wasn't simply war, though war losses played their part. Citizenship required holding enough land to fund a man's share of the communal meals every Spartiate was required to join. Lose that land, and a man lost the citizenship that had once seemed inseparable from being Spartan at all. Land moved steadily into fewer hands through inheritance, through sale and through marriage to wealthy heiresses who folded several estates into one. Fewer landholders meant fewer men who could still pay their share. And through it all, Sparta refused to open citizenship to outsiders who might have replenished the ranks. The requirements stayed fixed, even as fewer and fewer men could meet them. It's worth pausing here to name what shaped the popular image of Sparta that most people carry today. The uniform discipline, the indifference to comfort, the ruthless inspection of infants, much of this is a later invention layered onto the historical record. Scholars call this tangle of invented detail the Spartan mirage, and it distorts the truth in both directions, idealizing Sparta about as often as it condemns it. No surviving writer from Sparta's own time offers an account that idealizes it without qualification. Even the writers long treated as its admirers read, on closer inspection, as far more mixed, critical in places where popular memory expects only praise. A great deal of what passes for common knowledge instead traces back to a single biographer, writing 5 centuries after the fact, under Roman rule, drawing on centuries of accumulated legend rather than anything closer to the source. That invention didn't stay confined to antiquity either. In the 1930s, a Jewish scholar described Sparta as the first and greatest of all authoritarian states in history. Not long after, he was forced to flee for his life, an irony that followed him into exile. Elsewhere in the same decade, other historians used Sparta to support theories of racial supremacy. It took the field years after the war to work its way back out from under that framing. Later study traced how one Spartan king in particular, Leonidas, was shaped and reshaped across a century of German writing on the subject. Other Spartan kings from the same era were treated far more critically in that same literature. Leonidas alone was preserved as something closer to myth, a symbol of valiant, doomed soldiery, built for purposes that had little to do with the man who actually led 300 soldiers to a mountain pass. In the end, the hardest boundary in the Greek world turns out to rest on a conquest story that may never have happened, and an identity that may have been assembled rather than remembered. Now, to the edges of that world where belonging stops being so clean. Not every boundary in the Greek world was as rigid as the one just described. A foreign goddess has just been granted official Athenian honors, and her worshippers are marching in a procession all their own. Her name is Bendis, and she came from Thrace. Sometime around 429 years before the Common Era, the Athenian state wrote her into its religious calendar, in the opening years of a war that would not end for a generation. Some who study the date think it happened during the plague years, when Athens was burying its dead faster than it could grieve them, and may have turned to any god still listening. Either way, the honor was real. Bendis received a festival, state financing, and a place beside gods the city had worshipped for centuries. But even with that honor granted, her festival kept its worshippers apart. 2 separate processions formed on the night it was held. One left from the Prytanean in the heart of the city, moving the way an Athenian procession always moved. The other assembled among the resident Thracians of Piraeus, the port families who had brought her worship with them in the first place. Both walked the same long road down to the sanctuary by the sea. Both arrived at the same shrine, used the same washing basins and garlands, and ate the same communal meal before dark. What they did not do was walk together. When the torches were lit for the signature event of the night, it was the Thracian marchers who carried them, on horseback, galloping the relay through the dark in a style no Athenian torch race had ever used. Thracians were known across Greece for riding as Athenians never quite learned to. The cult's organization was split the same way. Two separate religious associations ran it, one Athenian and one Thracian, each handling its own half of a festival that only looked whole from a distance. This is what admission looked like at its most generous, recognition without merger. A foreign goddess was allowed all the way into the state calendar, and her worshippers still sorted on the night that mattered most into the same two columns the city drew everywhere else. A young Plato was there, or said to be. His account of the Republic opens with him recalling that very night, watching the horseback torches come down toward Piraeus. It is one of the clearest eyewitness moments the era left behind, and it happened at exactly the place where the line between citizen and foreigner was being drawn and crossed in the same hour. Even this well-documented case has a gap in the record. Herodotus knew Athenian religious life closely enough to describe it in detail elsewhere, and he wrote more than once about a Thracian goddess who answers to Artemis. But he never once calls her Bendis. Twice he comes close enough that a modern reader expects the name, and twice he does not give it. No one now can be certain whether he meant a different goddess entirely, or simply saw no need to name the one everyone around him already knew. It is a small gap inside one of the most trusted sources the era has left behind. Historians usually explain Greek religion through the city itself, and that explanation is worth questioning here. The common version holds that a person's relationship to the gods ran through the polis, much the way a citizen's political rights did, religion and civic identity treated as one structure with two names. It is a tidy, well-established picture, built up over decades of scholarship. But it has critics, and their objection matters for a case like this one. They argue the city-centered frame quietly adopts the citizen's own point of view, and in doing so flattens private devotion, mystery cults, and the kind of foreign-born worship a Thracian resident brought to Piraeus, fitting it all into a shape that suits the city's self-image a little too well. The debate is not settled, but the frame historians use to tell this story carries a citizen's bias built into it, and that bias is worth naming rather than repeating without comment. Bendis did not stay only at the harbour. Down at Lorion, in the mines that had been drawing on Thracian labour for generations, archaeologists have found her again in a smaller and later trace. A handful of votive statues and a single inscribed base mark, a small shrine to the same goddess, kept not by the state, but by the miners themselves. There was no torch relay here, no city procession, no funding voted by the assembly. Just a private devotion the workers carried into the tunnels, kept by people whose names the record rarely preserves. It was the same goddess their countrymen had once marched for in the light, now honored quietly in the place where they actually spent their lives. Further out still, past anything the assembly ever governed, the boundaries get even harder to draw. On the Nile Delta, in the final decades of the 7th century before the Common Era, a settlement called Naucratis rose at the pleasure of an Egyptian pharaoh. It was not one city's colony. Several Greek cities built it together under license from the Egyptian crown, which granted the Greeks a foothold on its soil and could revoke that foothold at will. What archaeologists have found there does not match the standard story of Greek settlement. Most of the pottery is Egyptian, not Greek. Egyptian-style houses stand where a separate Greek quarter might be expected. A shrine to the Egyptian god Amun sits near the temple the Greeks built for Aphrodite, close enough that the two cults likely shared the same calendar and possibly the same worshippers moving between them without much sense of contradiction. Naucratis was not a Greek outpost holding foreign ground at arm's length. It was a place where Greek and Egyptian life ran together at street level, in the pottery people ate from and the houses people slept in. One particular piece of Athenian identity, it turns out, first appears not in Athens but in Naucratis. Athens would come to worship Aphrodite under the title Pandemos, meaning of all the people, and tie that title to its own founding myth. The moment the scattered villages of Attica were said to have joined into a single political body. It is a civic story built for a city proud of its own unification. But the earliest known worship of Aphrodite Pandemos anywhere in the Greek world was not found in Athens. It was found in Naucratis, a settlement with no unified citizen body of its own, governed by outsiders belonging to no single people. What is certain is the order of events. The city that built an entire founding story around this goddess was not the first to worship her by that name. A settlement with no civic identity of its own got there first. Scholars still argue over what she meant to the traders who first honored her at Naucratis. Some read her as a deity simply open to anyone passing through a mixed port. Others read something closer to the civic figure Athens would later claim her as. But the sequence itself is not in dispute. The tie between a colony and the city that founded it did not always run in one direction. In several well-documented cases, it ran both ways. At Cyrene, in North Africa, a foundation decree survives that goes beyond sentiment. It grants a formal standing right for colonists to return to Thera, the mother city that had sent them out in the first place. Some scholars have questioned whether the decree reflects the original settlement or was written later and projected backward onto it. But movement between Cyrene and Thera in both directions is confirmed independently of the decree, which makes that doubt harder to sustain. The decree also sets out terms for Theran citizens who wanted to move the other way, out to Cyrene, and take up a place in the new settlement. The tie was written to run both ways from the start. At Corinth, the same pattern shows up in the history of a single family. Two ruling dynasties held power not only in Corinth itself, but across the colonies it had founded: Corcyra, Lucus, Ambracia, and Actorion. One bloodline governed both the mother city and its daughter settlements at once, even though the word colony suggests a relationship that ends the moment the new city is founded. Here it did not end. A citizen could leave, and in these documented cases, a citizen could still, in a real sense, come home. Even at the world's furthest edges, the boundary does not disappear. It lets a goddess in on the condition that her worshippers still walk apart. It mixes Greek and Egyptian pottery in the same houses without ever settling what the result should be called. It sends colonists out, and in some places keeps a door open behind them for centuries. The boundary that built the Pnyx to the size of a legal quorum is the same boundary standing at Piraeus, at Laurion, at Naucratis, at Cyrene. Smaller here, softer there, but never fully gone. Now to its largest counterexample of all cities that did not just negotiate the line between belonging and exclusion, but pooled the very sovereignty this whole story began by fragmenting. From cultural admission at the world's edge to the largest political counterexample of all. Cities did not only draw lines and guard them. Some cities pooled what the line was supposed to protect in the first place. Long before anyone called it a league, it worked like a shared market. Farmers from one town sold grain to buyers from the next, using the same weights, measures, and coin. When a dispute broke out over a flock that wandered across a boundary, both towns sent it to arbiters they already trusted, because they had settled disputes together for generations. None of this waited for a treaty. It grew the way an unofficial footpath grows across a field from repeated use long before anyone thought to build a real road there. By the time Alexander's armies were marching through Greece, nearly half its cities had given up some share of their own sovereignty to belong to something larger. This koinon was built not from a founding charter, but from decades of buying, selling, worshipping, and settling disputes together. The two best documented cases, the Achaeans and the Boeotians, share the same origin story, and it has nothing to do with shared blood. The Achaeans first gathered around the temple of Zeus Piraeus. The Boeotians gathered around the sanctuary of Athena Itonia. A yearly festival brought neighboring towns to the same altar. The same roads that carried worshippers to a shared god carried traders to a shared market. Common taxes followed, then common coinage, then a shared court to settle the disputes that markets and roads inevitably produce. The political structure came last. It formalized what practical life had already built. For a family in a Boeotian town, none of this arrived as an idea handed down from above. It arrived as the price of grain holding steady from one market to the next. It arrived as a coin that spent the same in a neighboring town as it did at home. It arrived as a judge from a third city, settling an argument no one at home could settle fairly. No one had to be persuaded to join the federation. It was simply how life had come to work. One transaction, one shared altar, one borrowed measure at a time. And these federations did not call themselves what history now calls them. No inscription reads, "The Boeotian Koinon." A dedication at Delphi, carved in the early classical period, states plainly, "The Boeotians give this to Athena Pronaia." It speaks not as an institution giving a gift, but as a people. Decrees followed the same pattern for centuries, speaking in the voice of the Boeotians or the Achaeans, the same way a single city spoke in its own name on its own dedications. Where the word koinon does appear in the record, it meant something narrower and plainer than the modern term suggests, simply the community, the people considered together. Boeotian decrees shift over time, from resolutions passed in the name of the people to resolutions passed in the name of the koinon, and the shift itself can be dated. That marks a real change in how the federation understood its own authority, not a scribe's careless variation in phrasing. The same shift shows up in Achaean decrees and dedications. The word league is a modern label laid over the evidence after the fact. The people who lived inside these federations recognized no separate government floating above their city. There were simply the Boeotians acting as one the way they always had. Shared ancestry does not explain federal membership as cleanly as it first appears to. Even in Achaia, the best documented of these federations, cities invoked shared blood constantly, but it decided almost nothing on its own. A city joined the koinon or left it for military and economic reasons first. Claims of kinship were added afterward to justify a decision already made. When the Achaean koinon later took in two cities with no Achaean ancestry at all, it did so anyway, because the move served the League militarily and economically, and that was reason enough. The language of kinship followed the decision. It did not cause it. In later centuries, the federation expanded for reasons that had nothing to do with the ethnic name carved above its own gate. The Boeotarch, the chief office of the Boeotian Federation, is older than historians once assumed. Recent excavations at a Theban sanctuary of Heracles turned up a bronze sheet buried for over 2,000 years. It records a decree dated the way Greek cities always dated their public business, by naming the official in office that year. This decree names a Boeotarch. Its letter forms place it decades before the reorganization historians had long treated as the League's true beginning. A dating formula only works if the office is already familiar. If a scribe could write the name of that year's Boeotarch and expect readers to understand what it meant, the office was not new. It was already routine and trusted long before the moment scholars had assumed federal Boeotia began. One surviving decree shows exactly what federal membership meant in practice. A marble stele honors a Laconian named Timus as a friend and representative of the Boeotian League. The text opens the way federal decrees always opened, naming the official in office and the citizen who proposed it. The wording is unremarkable. The carving is not. Above the text, 3 images climb the stone. The infant Heracles strangling serpents in his crib, the Laconian twin gods standing beside the goddess Athena, and beneath them, unmistakably, a warship. The timing explains the warship. Thebes was building its own naval power in those same years. It had also just marched an army into Spartan territory for the first time in memory, deep into land no Theban army had ever crossed before. A federal honor for a Spartan ally, decorated with a Boeotian warship, was carved almost exactly when that happened. The stone was not simply thanking a friend. It showed a Laconian visitor exactly how far Boeotian power now reached through an image he could not misunderstand. A warship stood carved beside the gods of his own homeland on a monument that praised him and warned him at the same time. At a sanctuary called Oropos, the same reach shows up carved into the ground itself. A decree honors a man from Rhodes, granting him the right to own property across Boeotian territory and to pay taxes at the same rate as any citizen anywhere in the Federation. A citizen of Plataea proposed the grant on the League's behalf, but the League itself issued it, and its authority ran well past the borders of any single city. What makes this case remarkable is where it was published and how many times. The League inscribed the honor twice, once on its own standing stone and once on the base of a statue. Both stood at the sanctuary, a holy site that answered to the League while still governing much of its own local affairs. Federal rights like this tended to fall into 3 categories: land ownership across the Federation, tax equality wherever a citizen traveled within it, and the right to marry across member cities. This stone did not describe an abstract policy. It sat in a busy public sanctuary where anyone could read exactly what federal citizenship bought a foreigner, carved twice so no one could claim they had missed it. In a smaller federation called Triphylia, 2 decrees from the same years show how the whole system actually worked. One grants a named individual citizenship in the federation itself, full political membership in the koinon as a body. The other grants citizenship in a single member town and nothing more. Two separate documents, drafted in the same years by the same government, used two entirely different legal instruments because they were granting two different levels of belonging. This distinction was not a description scholars invented afterward to explain a fuzzy dual loyalty. The federal authorities drew the line themselves, on stone, in real time. A citizen of the koinon was one kind of grant. A citizen of the smaller town was another, and the government that issued both knew exactly which one it was making. The Achaean Federation drew one line with total clarity. A citizen from any member city could travel to any other, buy land there, and own it under full legal protection, the same as a native. But that same citizen, standing in the assembly of that same city on voting day, had no voice at all. The ballot belonged to the home city alone. Property could cross a border. A vote could not, and every member city insisted on keeping it that way. This was not an oversight. The Federation simply never got around to fixing. It was the one right no city would surrender, even after giving up nearly everything else to the Federation. Historians point to this rule as the clearest sign of how far member cities would bend and how far they refused to. A man could own farms in 3 different member cities and still cast exactly one vote, in exactly one assembly, in the city where he had been born a citizen. Federal life had blurred almost everything else: land, coinage, courts, even the calendar a city used to count its own years. It never blurred that one line, the line between owning a place and belonging to it. The same layered belonging shows up carved into stone by an actual hand, not just argued about by historians after the fact. A Boeotian sculptor signed his own work with a phrase naming both halves of who he was, a Boeotian, and specifically a man from Orchomenos. Other sculptors working in the same federation, from the same milieu, signed themselves simply as Thebans, dropping the Boeotian label in favor of the city that led it. Orchomenos had spent generations resisting Theban-led leadership and never fully accepted it. One sculptor's signature carried both loyalties into permanent stone. The others chose only one, and neither choice was wrong, because the koinon never asked its citizens to have just one loyalty. 2 men worked the same stone in the same years, under the same federation, and signed their names as 2 different kinds of Boeotian. A large panel of judges once arrived in Corinthian territory, sent by a city that belonged to neither side in a dispute. This was not diplomacy. This was a trial. And the League had ordered it. 2 member cities, Epidaros and Corinth, had reached an impasse over a stretch of borderland, and neither would yield. Rather than let the dispute drift toward force, the League turned to a neighboring city outside the Federation entirely, chosen precisely because it had no stake in the outcome. That city sent a large panel of judges to examine the disputed ground in person and rule. They found for Epidaros. Corinth objected, not to the verdict itself, but to the exact line the ruling had drawn. Rather than reopen the whole trial, the League sent a smaller group of judges from the original panel back to the terrain. They fixed the boundary using landmarks anyone could see and no one could dispute. Inscriptions at a sanctuary in Epidaros still record both stages of the case, the verdict and the correction, permanent proof that this had actually happened. None of this was theatre. a federation had compelled two of its own powerful members to submit a border dispute to outside judges. It had accepted a verdict against one of them, then sent a second panel back to fix the details. This was arbitration working exactly as intended, backed by enough institutional weight that refusal was not a realistic option for either city. That machinery operated at real scale. One modern count finds well over 100 documented cases of interstate arbitration across the Greek world, with dozens more surviving only in fragments. An earlier survey done at the start of the 20th century had found only a fraction that many examples across the whole of Greek history up to that point. The gap between those two counts does not mean Greeks arbitrated more as the centuries wore on. It means archaeologists kept finding more inscriptions. Each new excavation added another case to a system that had likely always run at close to this larger scale. Even so, the system had a real limit: power. On the eve of the Great War between Athens and Sparta, with tensions already rising over rival allies, one of Sparta's own kings urged his city to submit the dispute to arbitration. He called it the lawful path and the cheaper one. Sparta refused anyway. A mechanism that could compel Epidaurus and Corinth to accept outside judges had no way to compel Sparta to accept anything it did not already want. Arbitration was real machinery, but it only worked with the consent of whoever held enough power to walk away from it. A second case shows how far that machinery could stretch when both sides stayed inside it. Two more cities, Megalopolis and Messene, disputed a stretch of borderland, and the process ran for months in recorded stages. Megalopolis opened with a formal written challenge, summoning Messene to name a neutral court. While the case waited to be heard, the two cities split the disputed land's crops evenly between them, an interim truce built directly into the legal process. The League convened a General Assembly and appointed a panel of prominent federal politicians to judge the case. It deliberately excluded anyone from the neighboring region, so no judge would carry a local stake into the verdict. The panel walked the contested ground in person at a sanctuary on the border between the two territories, with delegations from both cities beside them the entire way. When the ruling came down and Messene refused to comply, the League imposed a fine, later adjusted once the terms of ownership were fully settled. Nearly 200 lines of inscription survive from this single case, recording every stage: the challenge, the truce, the judges, the walk across rugged ground under an unforgiving sun, the fine. None of it was informal. This was law, built to outlast the argument that had required it. Boeotia ran the same kind of court on its own soil, without waiting for outside judges to arrive. When two of its cities disputed a border, the League's own court took the case and ruled. When two others argued over farmland near a lake, the League intervened again the same way, asserting jurisdiction its member cities had no real power to refuse. Once a verdict came down, judges set boundary stones into the disputed ground to make the ruling permanent. Both disputes sat close to Orchomenos, the region that had never fully made peace with Theban leadership, and the timing was not coincidental. A federation that placed its courts precisely where old rivalries ran deepest was not simply settling arguments as they arose. It was standing guard, deliberately, over fault lines it already knew were there. That strategy worked for a while, and then it did not always work. When Rome folded Sparta into the Achaean League, Sparta never accepted the arrangement as final. It tried to secede more than once, appealed past the league entirely to Roman arbitrators rather than submit to Achaean courts, and at moments took up arms outright. Boeotia faced its own version of the same problem. Orchomenos and Plataea resisted Theban-led centralization for generations, a grievance that never fully closed no matter how many border courts ruled in the league's favor. Neither case was a failure of the system. Both show the system working exactly as hard as it had to, indefinitely, against pressure that federal courts and federal citizenship could manage but never fully eliminate. Macedon found that pressure useful. So did Rome. Each recognized the same fracture lines the leagues had spent centuries trying to hold shut, and each in turn used them as leverage. In time, Rome dissolved the Achaean League outright, ending in one-act generations of pooled courts, pooled citizenship, and pooled sovereignty that had once made fragmentation look almost solvable. The federations had done something real. They built courts that could compel a powerful city to accept a stranger's verdict. They built citizenship that let a farmer own land 3 towns from home. They built decrees that named a man's loyalty in 2 directions at once and called neither of them false. None of it made the polis disappear, and none of it made belonging simple. It only proved on stone that still survives to be read that the Greeks had tried. There is no reliable number for how many people Athens enslaved. That gap in the evidence is not something to apologize for. It is itself an honest finding. And a piece of modern scholarship explains exactly why the wrong number took hold in its place and held on for so long. For decades, historians relied on a set of figures attributed to the Greek statesman Demetrius of Phaleron, drawn from an old census. 21,000 Athenians, 10,000 resident foreigners, and 400,000 household members, a category long read simply as slaves. Read that way, the ratio comes out to 19 enslaved people for every citizen, higher than any slave population ever recorded in any American state before its Civil War. Many historians accepted the figures anyway because the document looked old enough and specific enough to be believed. The historian Hans van Wees questioned those categories and found they meant something different than assumed. The citizen figure, he argued, counted only those above a certain property line tied to who could hold the highest offices, not to citizenship itself. The figure for resident foreigners likely folded in disenfranchised Athenians alongside genuine outsiders. And the household figure almost certainly included free women and children, not enslaved people alone. His revised numbers come out far lower, something closer to 30,000 citizens and only a few thousand resident foreigners. Even Van Wees's own reworked figures still put the ratio of enslaved to free residents near 3-1. He calls that number implausibly high himself, but argues it deserves serious treatment anyway, as a genuine estimate from the period rather than exaggeration. A later review of the field's leading population study credits his reinterpretation with reshaping how historians read Athenian numbers generally, though it notes that even that newer study still carries some of the same old assumptions. A document long used as proof of exactly how many people Athens enslaved was likely measuring something else from the start. The misreading shaped scholarship for decades before anyone thought to question it. The minds of Laurian show the same problem. 2 figures get repeated constantly, 20,000 enslaved miners, and a 4-year life expectancy underground in books, documentaries, and casual retellings of Athenian silver, always stated with the same flat confidence. Neither traces to any ancient source. No inscription gives that count. No ancient writer states that expectancy. No ancient census of the mining workforce survives to check either claim against. In short, the two figures were never actually counted. They were assembled from guesswork, then repeated until the guesswork stopped sounding like one. The honest range for Athens' total enslaved population runs from the tens of thousands to well over 100,000, drawn from what evidence does survive, spanning the whole of the classical period rather than any single year. That range depends on assumptions historians make about household size, about how much labor Athenian farms actually required, and about how deep the mine's demand for bodies really ran. Change any one of those assumptions, and the number moves by tens of thousands. The range feels unsatisfying, but it is correct precisely because it refuses to narrow further than the evidence allows. One further figure does rest on solid ground, the often cited 30% return on leasing enslaved miners, taken from a state revenue proposal written by the historian Xenophon. But it comes from a single source, not a large body of records checked against each other. It belongs in the record as a plausible estimate for one kind of transaction, not a fixed law of the ancient economy. The lesson from all of this is that a wide range, not a single number, is the honest answer to how many people Athens enslaved across the classical period. That is not a placeholder for a better number still waiting to be found. It is the correct answer in its own right, arrived at honestly rather than avoided. What exists instead of a clean count is a set of assumptions about household size, about labor needs on Athenian farms, about the mine's demand for bodies, and each one moves the final number by a wide margin. Van Weese's reading of the Demetrius census belongs in this same explanation, not as a separate curiosity. Both problems come from the same cause: too little surviving evidence combined with a documented case of modern misreading. The range is not a gap in the story. It is the story told honestly rather than smoothed into a number that never existed. This points to a wider pattern worth naming directly. Athens is frequently attested, meaning it left behind unusually rich evidence. That is not the same thing as being typical of Greek city-states generally. The city left behind more court speeches, more inscriptions, and more comic plays than any other city in the Greek world, by a wide margin. Almost nowhere else generated anything close to that volume of surviving record. That abundance makes Athens easier to study, but also easier to mistake for the norm. A practice documented 100 times at Athens and never once anywhere else might be common across Greece, or it might simply be common in the one place that wrote everything down. The census reinterpretation is the clearest case of this trap catching out real scholarship. A single Athenian document, overtrusted because it looked old and specific, shaped decades of population estimates because no comparable record survived anywhere else to check it against. The best documented case is not the same thing as the typical one. It only looks that way because it is the case history left the most evidence to be wrong about. The same problem appears when Athens stands in for Greece as a whole. Over 1,000 other city-states existed alongside it, catalogued one by one by a modern scholarly project surveying the whole Greek world. Most of them were nothing like Athens. The large majority were never democracies at all. Argos ran one, and so did a handful of other city-states, independently documented and largely forgotten beside Athens's fame. But the wider pattern was oligarchies, tyrannies, mixed constitutions, and federal leagues binding cities together under shared law. Athens was not the rule the rest of Greece followed. It was one outcome among many, distinguished mainly by how much of itself it managed to write down. That distinction, not political originality, did most of the work in making Athens feel typical. The trouble is not that Athens was unrepresentative on its own terms. The trouble is the size of the gap. Most Greek city-states never generated anything close to Athens's flood of court speeches, comic plays, and inscribed decrees. That gap means the popular template is not simply wrong about Athens's particular shape. It rests on a deeper mistake, treating abundance of evidence as if it proved how ordinary Athens's politics actually were. The evidence that survives shapes the modern picture more than the ancient politics themselves ever could. Even the modern tool built to correct that mistake carries a version of the same problem. That catalogue sorts its cities by dozens of separate criteria: name, location, the sense in which a place called itself a city-state, ethnic identity, territory, constitution, coinage, cult, and participation in the Great Games. Its own founder has acknowledged that what actually counts as a city-state was the central open question the whole project was trying to answer. Choosing so many criteria to answer that question means choosing, in advance, much of what the answer will look like. Other scholars have raised exactly this objection. Build an inventory around a fixed set of criteria, and it risks assuming the very category it claims to be discovering. The published volume runs far beyond its main catalogue, cross-referenced by name and by place, in 2 alphabets, and apparatus reviewers have called extraordinary even among major reference projects. This is not a flaw exactly, and it does not undo the value of the catalogue. But it is the same problem this chapter keeps returning to, appearing now inside the very instrument built to measure it. Even a tool made to correct a distortion can carry a version of that distortion in its own design. The evidence itself creates a final category of dispute. Even something as basic as who fought in Greek battles and what that fighting earned a citizen politically remains an unresolved question among specialists. The traditional picture holds a wall of roughly equal small farmers shoving forward together in battle, their military equality translating directly into political equality. The historian Hans van Wees rejects that picture. His research argues that Greek warfare in the earlier period involved looser formations than the tight, shoving battle line historians long assumed, and that meaningful political rights extended to only a small fraction of the free population, not a broad citizen farmer middle. This is not a settled correction. Other historians still defend versions of the traditional model in the very volume that contains Van Wees's own chapter, making the opposite case. A conference convened specifically to resolve the dispute, and its participants left having sharpened their differences instead. The disagreement runs deeper than tactics alone. Van Wees argues a soldier's armor and weapons functioned as a real wealth threshold, not equipment any farmer could simply afford, and that physical evidence from old farmland argues against the very rise in small farms that the traditional account depends on. Even the word colonization is disputed, not simply a label waiting for a better replacement. The historian Robin Osborne argues the term imports assumptions of centrally organized, state-directed enterprise that the evidence for early Greek settlement abroad does not support and prefers the word migration instead. Another historian, Irad Malkin, defends organized settlement as a real historical category, pointing to shared customs preserved across founding cities, to founder names kept consistent for generations, and to documented cases of return between colony and mother city. The two disagree sharply about what the correct word should be, but both agree on something larger. The popular picture of Greek colonization is disputed at the level of basic description, not merely stuck on terminology waiting for a better label. The dispute runs all the way down to what actually happened, not just what to call it. One more fixed error is worth naming before closing this chapter. The belief that the ancient Olympic truce stopped wars entirely is still repeated today, even by the institutions built to honor that tradition. The ancient truce protected travelers, athletes, envoys, and spectators making their way to and from the games. It never protected Greece from war generally, whatever the modern retelling assumes. The historian Thucydides records fighting during Olympic periods themselves. Athens destroyed the island of Melos only months after one truce period had run its course, a detail that undercuts the modern claim on its own. And yet an international body's own page on the Olympic truce still states as of today that all conflicts ceased during the period of the truce. That language repeats the ancient error nearly word for word on the institution's own current website. A historically real but narrow practice has been quietly inflated by the institutions most invested in its legacy into a piece the evidence never supported. Return now to where this chapter began. The Piraeus sits empty. The road back out to the Demes is quiet in a different way than it was before dawn. The hurdles are gone until the next meeting, and the city goes on around the space where all of it happened. Most of the people who made this city possible, the miner, the Metic, the enslaved person, the Hilot, the Thracian worshipper at Piraeus, never stood on this ground at all. That is not a coincidence. They are also the hardest people in this story to find in what the record has kept. The line that ran through the assembly, the mine, the house, the sanctuary, and the federal court was never just about who was let in. It was about who the whole structure depended on to stay standing, and how much of that dependence never made it into the story Athens told about itself. What stays after all of it is not a single wall or a single name. It is the shape of the boundary itself, drawn again and again, in stone, in law, in silence, the same line, wearing different faces. It ran through the assembly and the household alike. It ran through the mine shaft and the marriage bed. It ran through the sanctuary and the sea route, closing and reopening according to what the city needed, never according to who deserved more. The Greeks did not build their freedom beside that boundary. They built it on top of it. The vote in the assembly, the silver in the treasury, the grain on the table, the temples standing at the harbor. None of it stood apart from the people who were never allowed to hold it. The city did not simply exclude them and carry on regardless. It could not have stood the way it stood without them standing just outside it. There is something quietly instructive in that, and nothing triumphant about it. A civilization can be sincere in its ideals and still built on a debt it never repaid. The line between belonging and exclusion was not a flaw in the Greek city. It was one of its foundations, load-bearing in the truest sense, holding weight it was never given credit for holding. Most of history's grand structures rest on foundations no one thought to name. The Piraeus has gone quiet again. The demes are dark, the roads empty, the ochre rope coiled somewhere out of sight until morning calls the city back together. Somewhere below it, if the world still turned the way it turned then, a lamp is guttering in a tunnel no one wrote the name of. The city above never knew how much of its light depended on that one below. Let that be where this rests tonight. Not in a verdict, not in a lesson to carry forward. Just in the quiet of a line drawn so long ago it has worn smooth. Let your own evening settle the same way, unremarked and unhurried. Let the day's edges soften, the way old stone softens, until there is nothing left to hold on to but the stillness. Sleep now and let the city, and everyone who ever stood outside its gates, rest with you.